We are about to begin the conclusion of the fourth book of the Torah, the book of Numbers, which focuses on the time of the Jewish people in the desert. And this week it happens to be a double portion, the last two portions. So it's actually a very long reading. So we'll read the nutshell and then we'll see what we want to focus on and discuss. So here we go. Matot and Maseh. So Moses conveys the laws governing the annulment of vows to the heads of the tribes of Israel. So we're going to talk about the significance of that. Okay, war is waged against Midian for their role in plotting the moral destruction of Israel. And the Torah gives a detailed account of the war spoils and how they were allocated amongst the people, the warriors, the Levites, and the high priests. So this is just two lines in the nutshell, but in the actual reading, it takes up a very, very large space. The Torah enumerates exactly how much spoils they took and how it was divided, and the total percentage and the subtotals, and that's all takes up a whole long spot. So we may want to think about that as well. The end of the first parsha that we're going to read is the tribes of Reuven, Gad, later joined by half of the tribe of Manasseh, ask for the lands east of the Jordan as their potential portion in the promised land. These being prime pasture land for their cattle. So the Jewish people are camped east of the Jordan. They conquered a vast area of land, and two tribes say, we'd rather stay here. Now for Moshe, this was a terrible crisis. Moses is initially angered by the request because he's afraid that this is a repeat of the story of the spies where the people don't want to go into Israel, but subsequently agrees on the condition that they first join and lead in Israel's conquest of the lands west of the Jordan. So they tell Moshe, no, we're going to lead the battle, and Moshe then agrees to give them the land east of the Jordan. That's the first portion that we read. The second portion is Maseh, literally means journeys. The 42 journeys and encampments of Israel are listed. From the Exodus to their encampment on the plains of Moab, across the river from the land of Canaan. The boundaries of the promised land are given, and cities of refuge are designated as havens and places of exile for inadvertent murderers. The daughters of Tzalafchad marry within their own tribe of Manasseh, so that the estate which they inherit from their father should not pass to the province of another tribe. What's happening there is based on last week. Last week, we read the story of the five daughters of Tzalafchad who said their father died without any sons. They want their father's portion that was granted to them. At this point, when they're about to cross into the land of Israel, the leaders of that tribe approach Moshe and say, what happens if these daughters, these girls marry out of our tribe? That would mean that the land would then be given to a different tribe, because the tribal division follows the man, follows the husband. So Moshe says, well, that's a correct claim, and therefore these girls who inherit land should marry from within their own tribe. The commentaries explain that was a one-time law. That was only for the first time they entered the land of Israel and divided the land. Because when they divided the land, the division of the tribes was supposed to be absolute. But afterward, land actually could travel from tribe to tribe through marriage, and it probably would have been a good thing. In other words, once you have an absolute division when they enter, then it's okay to marry out of the tribe, even if land will transfer to other tribes. So that's the oral tradition. Okay, so that's the conclusion of the fourth book of the Torah. And in some sense, this is the conclusion of the Torah, because the fifth book of the Torah is repetition. So this is like, okay, this is the end in some sense. Yeah, we have the last day of Moshe's life is discussed after the fifth book, but something about here, this really should end on a high, and that's the question. Are we really ending on a high? Are we ending with something uplifting? Or what theme was chosen to conclude the fourth book of the Torah, and in some sense, all of the Torah? So that's also something we want to focus on. There's a lot of details to talk about. There's a lot to do, a lot of work to do. So all we can do is begin. Then we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, if anybody wants to discuss any specific episode of this parsha or draw attention to anything specific, please do. Otherwise, we start in the beginning and we know where we start. We don't know where we're going to finish. I guess that's a good thing. Okay, so I guess we could start with the first verse. We'll read the Torah, we'll read the verse inside, and then we'll try to run through some of the major episodes. Here we go. Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the children of Israel, saying, "This is the thing that the Lord had commanded." And what follows is the laws of the nullification of vows, which we'll talk about in a minute or two. The first thing we want to talk about is the name of the parsha, which is, I believe this is the only time, not the only time, the only time a parsha starts with Moshe speaking to the leaders of the tribes. But it's interesting to note the word matot. What is the word matot? So here they translate it as tribes, that's the meaning. But there's another word in biblical Hebrew for the word matot. That's the word we're focusing on, matot. And the other word is shevet. And if you look at the biblical Hebrew, so you have two names for tribes. You have shevet and you have mateh. What do they mean? So shevet means a branch. Sort of, that would make sense, right? Because you have different tribes of the same people or different tribes of the same family is like the metaphor of a tree. You have one tree. You have one trunk, that's the sort of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and then things branch out. And that's where you have your 12 tribes, so the families branch out. And that's the name tribes, the typical name, which is shvatim, shevet as branch. Here we get to a new word, and here it's called, instead of calling it the shvatim, the heads of the shvatim, it says Rashi HaMatot, the head of matot. What does matot mean? So mateh now means stick. Earlier in the Torah, when you talk about Moshe had his staff, it's mateh. This is matot. So in other words, there's two words for the tribe. There is a shevet, which is a branch, and there's a mateh, which is a stick. Now, why do you have two names for the same tribe? First of all, what's the connection between these two names? So that's easy, because what is a stick? A stick is really a branch. The difference is that when it's a branch, it's part of the tree. And when it's part of the tree, it's alive, or it's connected, it's growing, it's still growing. It's also soft because it's part of the tree, it has life. A stick is now severed from the tree, even though it really is a branch. But when the branch is severed, when the branch is disconnected from the tree, that's when you refer to it as a stick. And as a result that it's disconnected, it hardens because it loses the life, it loses the moist. And in that sense, it was a branch and it becomes a stick. So why do we refer to the tribes as tribes and sticks? So tribes would represent the idea that they feel connected to their patriarchs and matriarchs. In other words, they feel connected to the tree. They don't sense their own independence. Once you say a stick, it means they're less connected to their source. And they don't see themselves so much as part of an outgrowth of the source, but rather they are becoming disconnected and strong. And it could be that now we're moving into Israel, and especially until the Israel became a monarchy, about 400 years, a little bit less, about 400 years after they entered the land of Israel. At that point, it was very tribal. In other words, till they made a monarchy, it was very tribal. It was divided into tribes. Tribes sometimes came to assist other tribes, sometimes more often than not did not. And in some sense, there was a greater division between the tribes, certainly more than they were in the desert. So at some point, they're transitioning from a branch, which a branch is, again, I feel part of the tree, to a stick, which I feel separate and independent. So maybe that's why when we're coming into Israel now, we refer to them as sticks as opposed to branches. There's also a very mystical and Kabbalistic interpretation. And the interpretation is like this. When the soul is in heaven, it's called a branch because it feels connected to its source, to God. When the soul comes into this earth, it is called a stick. A stick in the sense that it has the same sort of DNA of the branch. It is a branch. It's connected to its source, but now it's distant, it's separate, it's disconnected. And that's the soul's experience when the soul is in this earth. When you look at it that way, it seems that that's a descent. Going from branch to stick is a downgrade. And the answer is it is in one sense, but in another sense, it's an upgrade. And that's alluded to in the fact that the stick has an advantage over the branch, and that is that the stick is firm. So the stick is firm. If you need a walking stick, you can't take a branch. You need a stick. You need one that's firm. And what that represents is that when the soul separates from its source and comes down into this world and faces the challenges, yes, it feels less connected to its source. That's correct. But it also becomes much stronger. And stronger represents spiritual strength. It's able to overcome the challenges. It has to find deeper strength within itself because in heaven, it was connected to God, but there was no challenges. And like a walking stick, the soul can be elevated. As opposed to when the soul was in heaven, it was stationary. Through coming into this world, disconnecting in a sense, being severed from its source, it now becomes much stronger, and like a walking stick, it actually can be elevated. So that's a very poetic and beautiful metaphor. Why are we using this metaphor right now when the Jewish people are about to cross over the Jordan and into Israel? Maybe because that exactly is that is exactly what happens when we go into Israel. On one hand, we are becoming more physical. We're going into the land and we're going to start investing in agriculture, which takes a lot of time and takes a lot of effort, and we have less time to devote to spirituality, especially in light of the book of Genesis, where all the patriarchs were always shepherds because they wanted to be separate from civilization. They didn't want to get involved in agriculture because they wanted to have a spiritual pursuit, which was shepherding, where you have plenty of extra time. Now, they're moving into the land of Israel. Now they're almost figuratively moving from branches to sticks. So you think it may be just a downgrade, where we say, no, it's an upgrade. Because if you can bring holiness to the mundane, that makes you stronger, and it also elevates you to a far higher place. So that's a little bit about the name of the parsha. Even before we get into the parsha, that's the name of the parsha, at least the name of the first parsha. Then we have the second name is Masei, journeys. So we put the two together. It's almost like the stick for the journey, right? That's really what's happening. So our soul's descent into this world is the journey. Going into Israel is the journey. When you go on the journey, you're leaving your natural spiritual haven. You're leaving the feeling of being a branch, which is connected to your source. You're becoming more like a stick. You're asserting your own independence. You go into a foreign space, but you're also journeying, and journeying is in the positive. You're becoming stronger. And because you have to not only not be influenced by your surroundings, but you have to influence your surroundings. And as a result, the soul is elevated to a higher space after its journey in this world, because for the first time, it was able to achieve something and create something new, which was overcome the challenges. So that's a little bit about both names, Matot and Masei, the stick for the journey. Okay. Now we can go into a little bit of what is the actual first law that we discuss. So the law is about vows. And the idea here is, the law as it's spelled out here, is that a woman, the starting point is, if someone makes a vow, you have to keep your vow. But then there are ways to nullify the vow. And the way you nullify the vow is that a woman who's young, who's not married, she makes a vow, her father could nullify the vow. If a woman has a vow, she says, I'm never going to eat chocolates. And then she gets married. The husband, the first day when the husband marries her and he hears the vow, he could nullify the vow. And there are many, many details in the written Torah and oral Torah which describe the parameters of this law. Now, there is a fascinating law which is not written explicitly in the written Torah, but it's in the oral Torah. And that is that just like the Torah says that there are ways for the woman's vow to be nullified, a man's vow can also be nullified. How so? How so? So even though it's not written explicitly in the Torah, it's only alluded to in the Torah, to the extent that, but the rabbis say is that you can go to the court, both man and woman can go to the court, and the court could undo the vow. Not nullify the vow, but undo the vow. How do you undo the vow? So there's a whole process. And the process basically says the court has to establish that it was a vow that was premised on a mistake. And if it was premised on a mistake, they can undo it. So for example, if I make a vow, I'm never going to eat meat. And then they tell me, sometimes eating meat a little bit could be healthy. I say, had I known, I would never make that. I would never make the vow. So in other words, the vow is predicated on a mistake. You can undo the vow. Called hatarat darim, undoing the vow, as opposed to nullifying the vow, which is what the Torah says. Nullifying the vow means it's a fine vow, but the father or husband override it. Undoing the vow is the court is able to show that the vow was not binding to begin with because it was predicated on a mistake. Okay. The Mishnah, by the way, is a whole section. The Mishnah, the oral Torah says, Heter nedarim porchim ba'avir. It says the idea that you're not going to nullify a vow is flying in the air, meaning to say there's no source in the biblical in the biblical law. It's totally oral tradition. Other parts of the oral law there in the Mishnah, it says it's like mountains hanging on a strand of hair. In other words, there's so much oral law, only one verse. But here it's flying in the air. There's no source. There's no source. Some people say, well, the source is God spoke to the leaders of the tribes. Why is God speaking to the leaders of the tribes? I'm sorry, Moshe spoke to the leaders of the tribes. Why the leaders of the tribes? Why are you telling the leaders of the tribes about the laws of nullifying the vows? What do the leaders of the tribes have anything to do with nullifying the vows? So this may be a reference to the fact that the leaders, meaning the judges, could nullify the vow. Okay, so now, if you want to get into the details of the nullifying of the vow, you could do. You could ask a question if you want to discuss it and talk about it. That's another story. Let's look at the big picture. What's the big picture of what does nullifying of the vow represent spiritually? We want to look at the spiritual connection because that's going to be applicable to us. And also, once we understand the spiritual meaning of the nullification of the vow, what is it doing right here at the end of the fourth book of the Torah? There are not a lot of laws given in the last two parshas. Even the laws that are given as a result of events that show up. For example, the laws of koshering vessels. It's because they went to war and they took a lot of spoils. So how do you kosher the vessels? Okay, but that we understand why it came up here because it's relevant. We have the laws of the daughters of Tzalafchad should not marry out of the tribe because they just got their portion. So we understand why it was written now. But this law of nullifying the vows, what is it doing here? Like, why wait to the last section, second to last portion of the book of Numbers before you tell me the law of nullifying the vows? So once we understand the spiritual significance, we'll understand why it's talking about over here. So just give me 60 seconds introduction about vows, and then we'll try to apply it here. So what does a vow represent? Vow represents that I say that something that is permitted in the Torah. Remember, in the Torah there are things that are prohibited, but most things are neutral. Here it's permitted. Some things are an obligation, but most things in the world are permitted. Now, what is a vow? A vow is I say that something that is permitted for me, I say I'm not doing it. For me, it's a prohibition. That's a vow. Now the question is that a good thing or not a good thing? Should I be saying this? Should I be saying I'm taking a vow, I'm not going to eat chocolate ice cream? Now, I have nothing against chocolate ice cream. Actually, I do. I don't like the taste, but vanilla ice cream. Okay. So should I be taking vows? So you see conflicting statements by our sages. So the first thing the sages say in the Jerusalem Talmud, Maimonides quotes it, Talmud says, it should be enough for you that which Torah prohibited. We have 365 prohibitions. Don't add a prohibition. You don't want to eat vanilla ice cream. Don't eat vanilla ice cream, but don't make it a prohibition. Once you take a vow and you say, I'm not going to eat it, then if you violate the vow, that would be a sin. So it seems to be that Maimonides is saying, quoting the Talmud, saying, don't vow. On the other hand, there are other sources in the rabbinic literature and Shakir Avot, Nidarim Siyag Laprishut. Vows are a tool that helps you become more spiritual and more holy. So it sounds like it is good. So is it good or is it not good? So the understanding is as follows, that essentially Judaism is not about vowing. It's not about separating ourselves from things that the Torah permits, because we're not trying to be, we don't necessarily believe in asceticism to separate ourselves from worldly pleasures. That's not the point of Judaism. The point of Judaism is to elevate. So it's to engage with the physical material pleasures and to use them for a higher purpose. So in that sense, if Torah said this is not allowed, if Torah said it's allowed, who are you to say it's not allowed? You could use it and use it for the service of God. Okay, you don't have to eat the whole tub of ice cream, but if you put a little bit of ice cream in your coffee, maybe it's going to be good for you. Maybe it's going to help you study Torah. So don't make a vow. That's sort of the general rule. However, there are certain cases with certain people that certain things for them pose a unique spiritual challenge, whatever it may be. And for me, I see not only I cannot use this item in a positive, productive way, but if I engage with it, it's actually going to harm me. For the alcoholic, it may be alcohol. For other people, other addictions, it may be other addictions. But the point here is, when I engage with this thing, I don't elevate it. It pulls me down. Mentally, spiritually, emotionally. And therefore, even though usually Judaism says your job is to elevate, but we understand that some people cannot elevate, and some things they're attracted to, and the only thing that will stop them is a vow, because they understand this is serious business. So in that case, make a vow. Because when you make a vow, you're going to separate yourself from it. And if you separate yourself from it, then at least you won't elevate it, but at least it won't bring you down, right? I open the back of jelly beans. I cannot eat one jelly bean. I have to eat the whole pack. And then I ate the whole pack. And then I feel sick and I feel upset and I feel depressed. Now, I live in America, so you can't buy a pack of jelly beans with 4 jelly beans. No, you only can get the big packs that are a few hundred, right? So I have to eat a few hundred jelly beans. No, so separate yourself from it. But I can't. So make a vow, right? I don't just mean that an example. That's one example. There could be many examples where something brings me down. It's not constructive in my life. It's destructive. It takes away my focus. It takes away my joy. It takes away my presence. So the point here is vows are not the ideal. The ideal is to engage, use it in moderation or not moderate, depending how you need it. Use it as part of your process of serving God, and use it as something that will enhance your existence. So then you'll be able to serve God and be a happier person and be more healthy and be able to do your purpose of creation. So that's the ideal. But we understand there are exceptions, and the exception is the vow. Okay, what is the nullification of the vow? If there is a process of nullification of the vow. Now, we're not going to get into the mystical thing. What is a father? What is a husband? What are the sages? The bottom line is there's a way to nullify the vow or undo the vow. Mystically speaking, what that means is after I separate, I have to find a way to mature spiritually. I don't have to, but I could. I could find a way to mature spiritually. And then I get to the point where what was now a distraction would now actually be able, will actually be able to enhance me. Once I say no, I could find a way to say yes. And that's the spiritual meaning of nullifying the vow or undoing the vow. Now I'm elevated to the space where I could elevate it. But what's interesting is first you have to say no before you could say yes. Because if you don't say no, you're not in control. Once you're in control, you put down the boundaries. I'm in control. Now I'm separating myself from this. Now I can use it in moderation. Now I can control it. It won't control me. So that is the spiritual meaning of nullification of the vows. We can get into the details if you have time. If we can get into the details if it interests anybody. The big question is, why is this mentioned right here? So it's mentioned right here because figuratively, what's happening right now, we're nullifying the vow. What is the vow? The vow is being separated from the physical world. The Jewish people were just in the desert for 40 years, separating apart from the physical world. And you know what happened? The first time they encountered the civilization, was it 2 parashas ago? What happened? It was a complete debacle. What happens is they went astray. They followed the daughters of Moab and the daughters of Midian. And they get involved with harlotry and all kinds of terrible immoral behavior. Why? Because they were separated from the world. And then when the second they engage with the world is too tempting and they succumb. So what's happening here is we need a spiritual process to heal yourself from the vow. to move from the state where you were separate from the physical temptation to the point where you're elevated to where you actually could use the pleasures of the world in a holy and a constructive way. And that's why as they're about to enter the land of Israel, leave the desert, they're really moving from a state of just spirituality where there's no distraction to a space where there's the worldly matters that have to be elevated. So that's why we give the introduction of, yeah, there is a way to nullify the vow. There was a way where something that yesterday was a distraction for me, but today I could be elevated to the point where not only it wouldn't bring me down, but I would actually be able to use it and it will enhance my service of God. So that's the first point. We said something about the name of the parsha, matot, the sticks, and going into Israel hardens us, but hardens us means it has two sides to the coin. Side number one is moving away from our source, moving away from spirituality. But side number two, there's spiritual advantages to that because it takes more strength, it takes more effort, it takes more resolve, and that brings in, that intensifies, makes stronger our commitment to God, and that helps us journey to higher planes. That's point number one. Point number two is, at this point, we're going into Israel. We need the skill not of separating from the world, which we had in the desert, which represents the idea of a vow, but the idea of engaging with the world, which is nullification of the vow. Now, that's generally as a nation. As an individual, every person could make a vow for themselves. Now, we don't make a vow in the literal sense because it's too big of a spiritual risk, because if you take a vow, then you have to keep it. But the idea, what the vow represents, the idea is that if something is a challenge, separate from it, say no, and then you may be able to use it and incorporate it. That is something everybody could use in their life, because everyone knows there are certain things that serve a distraction for me. Okay, so the question is, am I controlling it? Is it controlling me? Well, what's the test? The test is if you could turn it off. If you could say no and go a period of time without it, then when you then use it, you could incorporate it, hopefully in a healthy way. And if not, then you don't use it, then you just separate from it, and somebody else will elevate it. So in other words, there's the ideal, which is to elevate, but then there's the practical, which not everybody can do it all the time. And that's why there's the path of the vow, even though we don't do literally a vow. In fact, whenever we make a commitment, we say b'li neder, without the force of a vow, because it's a serious obligation to have a vow. But in any case, like I said, the attitude of the vow is also what we're talking about, and it's probably a good idea to incorporate it. And sometimes I say no, and then I say yes. And if I say yes after I say no, I'm in control. But if I can't say no to begin with, then I'm probably not in control. Okay, so that's the first point, the point of the story of the vows.
Rabbi, it talks about girls having their vows nullified. What would happen if a boy made a vow?
So in the biblical story, in the simple meaning of the written Torah, there's no one that can nullify it. The oral Torah says, well, the only way to nullify it, the father cannot nullify it, the wife can't nullify it. You would have to go to the court, and the court would have to see if there's a way to undo it. So there's no nullification. In Hebrew, there's two words. There's hafarat nedarim. Hafarat nedarim would be nullification of the vow. And then there's hatarat nedarim, which is undoing of the vow. And the Torah doesn't mention hatarat nedarim. It doesn't mention undoing or opening up or untying, because that's the oral Torah, and that's done by the court. So the answer to your question is the answer to the question is that nobody can do it for a boy or a man. It has to be done. You would have to approach the court, and the court would have to give you a way to undo it.
And the reason that boys and girls, even if they're not of age to be responsible, why would the boys still be responsible?
Okay, so they're not responsible if they're young boys. In other words, if you want to go into the details, there's the vow is not binding until the girl is 11 or the boy is 12. So that's mufla samach leish, where they're mature enough to understand the force of a vow, and at that point the vow becomes binding. Now there's a whole tractate in the Talmud of Nedarim, tractate in the Talmud called Dharma Valves, which we can spend a few years on this. But I do want to, but it is moving from the mystical. So we just spent a few minutes on the mystical. Let's move to the practical for just 2-3 minutes and see what, if we can look at this from another angle, more of a historic, practical angle more than just the mystical, which we began with. Because I know we're Hasidim and we love the mysticism, but we also have to be grounded and we have to think about the Torah in the practical sense and also in the context that it was, in the time that it was written in. So what Elisa is addressing is it seems that it's somehow the woman has less autonomy. In other words, a woman makes a vow, her husband could nullify it the day they get married. A young woman makes a vow, the father could nullify it the day he hears about it. The man, there's no such process. There's the rabbinic process, but there's no such process. So why is that? So the first thing we're going to do is talk about practically what the rabbis do. The rabbis narrow the scope of the nullification. In other words, the husband can only nullify a vow, or the father can only nullify a vow that's relevant to them. In other words, if the wife says, I am never going to, I'm never going to go on vacation to your favorite vacation spots. So the husband says, I'm nullifying a vow. He can't force her to go, but he could take away the prohibition. Why? Because it's things that matter to him. In other words, relevant to him. Things that are not relevant to him, she makes a vow, he can't nullify it. So what we just did was just narrow the scope of what the husband and father could nullify. But nevertheless, it's clear that there's some amount of quote unquote power that the husband has. Again, I reiterate this, not to force the wife to do anything she doesn't want to do, but to remove the prohibition. In other words, if she has a change of heart, it's not going to be binding. She says, I'm making an oath that's going to be binding for me to go visit your mother. He says, no, it's not binding. It's not a prohibition. Can't force you to go, but it's not a prohibition. Okay, fine. So what is really happening here? So what's happening here is that in the Torah, at least in that time, but in the Torah, we see the father, it seems like the father or the husband or the man is the patriarch. He's the ruler of the family. And therefore, the wife can't be forced to do something she doesn't want to do, but she has to understand she's not living in a vacuum. She's living as part of this family. And therefore, other people also have a say in the prohibitions because I'm not a person for myself, I'm part of a larger unit. Now, when you look at the biblical Torah, written Torah, it sounds like the wife, the girl, is part of a larger unit, but the father, the patriarch, he's his own man. Nobody could step in when he makes a vow. He could decide for himself what the prohibitions are. He's a man for himself. Nobody could oversee him, so to speak. And that's where the oral Torah comes in. The oral Torah says, one second. Oral Torah says, no. You could also, if you make a vow, you have to undo it. You have a process to undo it. What the sages are really saying is, Mr. Patriarch, you're sitting high on your horse and you think that you're an independent person. We say, no, you're also part of a community. You're also part of other people. Your actions also affect other people. And therefore, we're going to find a process that you can also nullify your vow. So it's a little bit different than the way it happens with the woman and with the married woman. But the point here is that one way to look at it, more of a psychological way to look at this, is what are the sages really doing here? The sages are really doing here and saying, well, they're saying the Torah says this, but it was much more obvious in that society that a woman is part of the family unit. And the woman has to take into consideration the needs of other people because she's part of a larger unit. It was much less obvious that the man is part of a larger unit. And that's what the sages say. Sages say you're not a sort of patriarch that it doesn't have to consider anybody else. You're also part of a larger unit. First of all, your family, but also the community. What is your obligations to your neighbors, to the broader community? So that's another way of looking at it. I'm not sure if I made it better or made it worse. That you could either tell me or not tell me if you like it better or worse, if it made it easier to understand or harder to understand. But I'm just trying to give out different approaches, so you don't just remain a mystic. You also have a little practical perspective as well. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I'm just trying to give a little bit of a positive spin to the nullification of the vows. So you can interpret it as not as a prohibition, but the nullification itself is the kind of manifestation of somebody who is taken care of. So it's not like you are in control, but you are taken care of. So even if you made a mistake, you'll be taken care of. So that's the positive.
I think some people, but I think some people would object to that because they would say, I don't want to have somebody that takes care of me It should be my own autonomy. It should be my own decision whether or not my vow should be binding.
Right,
And-
but it's nullified only if she doesn't want to.
No. The husband and the father could nullify it even against her will. Again, they can't force her to do something against her will. Say the woman says, I am never, you love going to your family on Passover. I make a vow, I'm never going to your family on Passover. Makes that vow. The day the husband hears it, only has 24 hours, but the day the husband hears it, he has the power to say, sorry, my beloved wife, that vow is not binding. There's no prohibition. Now, does it mean he could force her to go to his house? No, but it means the vow is not binding. And that's against her will. It doesn't matter if she wants to or not want to. And that could be that obvious. To be honest, what that's doing is that's saying to the woman, look, like I said, the rabbis are narrowing the scope. It's not about any vow. She says, I vow I'm never going to read this book. I don't like this book. I'm never going to read it. And he says, no, I'm nullifying your vow. No, it's nothing to do with you. What's got to do with you? Take a hike. He has no power. But if it's something that's sort of going to interfere with the family unit, then the husband or the father have the right to nullify. Now, let's just be honest. That's what it's saying. So there is a certain amount of control that the patriarch has. Now, again, he can't force her to do something, but he could force her to remove the prohibition. It's no longer a prohibition. So yes. So we can go to the mystical element, which is very inspiring, but we cannot move away from the practical applications of that law, which means that the woman, in other words, the married woman or the daughter, you in that society, in other words, in that culture, you didn't have your own autonomy or complete independence. So you're part of a unit. So before you start making prohibitions before you start introducing prohibitions that would impact everybody around you, understand that you're part of a greater unit. So in those matters that affect other people, you can't do it. Now, what are the rabbis doing? The rabbis, even though it's not written in the Torah, they're insisting, Mr. Man, you're also part of a larger unit. So it doesn't say in the Torah, there's no one to nullify your vow. Okay, but we're going to find a way that we say, just because you made a vow, look, if it's going to pertain to other people and it has to be nullified, we'll find a way to nullify. How do you nullify a vow? I made a vow, I'm never going to go to my mother-in-law. Okay, let's say I did. Then I go to the rabbi, and the rabbi said, had you known it's going to make your wife upset, would you make the vow? I say, of course not. Okay, the vow is nullified. Okay, but what are we trying to do here? What we're trying to do here is show to the man himself, we also have a process for you to undo your vows. We also have to recognize, why would you undo your vow? A vow is a beautiful thing. In other words, why would we give you a process to nullify the vow? There would be this opening statement, if you want to look at the parasha, if you want to look at the Torah, the starting point is, no, you must keep your vow, right? Let's look at the parasha. The first verse, a man makes a vow to the Lord or makes an oath to prohibit himself. He shall not violate his word. According to whatever came out of his mouth, he shall do. That's the first statement. The first statement is you make a vow, you have to keep your word. That's the starting point. Now, if we're going to go and look, if the sages are going to go and look for a process to help you undo your vow, why are we doing that? In quote unquote violation of verse 2. Verse 2 says you made a vow, keep your vow. So why are we giving you a way out? Why are we giving you a loophole? Why are we giving you a way out of the vow? So probably, maybe, because there's a deeper message here. The deeper message here is there may be a time where you didn't notice it, perhaps, but maybe that's part of the problem that you didn't notice it, but your vow impacts the people around you. And you're not a man for yourself. You're a member of a family, you're a member of a community, member of a Jewish people. And therefore, we need to give you a way out, because even if for you as an individual, you would want to keep your vow, but you're keeping your vow may harm the people around you. So I'm acknowledging that the woman here has less control in certain instances, maybe narrow instances, but in certain instances, the man has more autonomy. But if because in that culture, yes, the man was the patriarch and the man had more power. But then the question becomes, what are the rabbis doing here? And the rabbis, first of all, they're limiting the power to nullify. Remember, we're not talking about forcing her to do something she doesn't want to do. We mean removing the prohibition, but we're narrowing the scope of when he can undo the vows. That's number one. And number two, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, you also have a way to nullify your vow. And the meaning of that is you also have a way, you also have to recognize that maybe the vow is good for you, but you have to look around you. And maybe it's harming the people around you. And therefore, even though verse 2 said, when man makes a vow, you should keep your vow, we're going to find a way out. Why? Because maybe the person next to you is suffering from your vow, and you're not a person for yourself. So that's a more practical way of looking at this. Again, there's so many other interpretations. I figured we should offer at least two.
So is this also on a broader scale, like Hashem saying that we need to follow the mitzvot, and we have to do that because we have to look at it that we're part of a bigger whole? And so like Hashem is the father here saying whether something should be nullified or not?
Yeah, so let me think about this. So mystically speaking is the Father is God. Okay, let's go back to the mystical. Mystical, as I told you for a moment ago, is that the vow means I feel that something in this world, some temptation of this world, some physical pleasure in this world I cannot incorporate it into my life. Because if I try to use it for the service of God, it's going to distract me to the point that it's going to bring me down. So what did we say? We said, spiritually, what I have to do is I have to go and be elevated to the point where I can nullify the vow in the sense that no longer is the vow a challenge, no longer is that object that I vowed against a spiritual challenge, but it can actually be a spiritual enhancement. How do I do that? So there's two ways. If I'm a woman, every Jew's a woman. The Alter Rebbe has a discourse, many discourses in this parsha. The Isha Kitadur, a woman who will make a vow. The verse in this Torah. Isha, woman, is Knesset Yisrael, is the collective souls of Israel. The Jewish people are the women, God is the man. So if I make a vow, meaning I feel that the world is a threat, something in this world is a threat. I go to God, God elevates me. In other words, my spiritual connection to God is intensified. And then I no longer need to vow, now I can elevate the world. So what's the father and what's the husband? There's two forms of a relationship with God. And we said this in the past when we studied the Song of Songs and other times. There's two forms of my relationship with God. One is father-child, which is natural love. And natural love is consistent, but it's not passionate. And then you have a romantic love of a spouse. And that is, it's not constant, it's not natural. There are always obstacles. It's difficult to create it. It doesn't always happen. But when it happens, it's with tremendous intensity. That's the difference between love to a family member, love to a sibling, love to a parent, or love to a spouse, which is something that's a stranger. So romantic love each has advantages. One is more constant, but not passionate. The other one is occasional, but very passionate. So according to the mystical interpretation, there are two ways where you can elevate yourself and your connection to God to the point where the world is no longer a threat, where this object is no longer a threat. Either you reveal the natural love you have for God, and we could talk about this. Av is chachma, according to if you want to go, depending how mystical you want to go. Father could also be wisdom, and wisdom means enlightenment. Wisdom means you get a new level of awareness where you understand that the world is really an extension of God. So that's the father element. You have the natural love to God that comes from the awareness. Chachma is wisdom, is awareness. Or you have the passionate love that comes not from feeling that you're one with God, to the contrary, the feeling that you're distant from God and you're a creation, but just like spouses are not the same and they're different. And because they're different, there could be challenges in the relationship. But when they create the bond, it's much more passionate. The love is much more passionate. So too that's a different dimension of our connection to God. So if you want to go mystically, that's the way the mystics do it. That the father and husband represent two ways of intensifying my connection to God.
Thank you.
Okay, this has been a lot of fun. The problem is we only have 12 minutes left. So now the question is, what do we talk about? I want to address the last portion of the Torah, because the last verses, because it's the end, and we also, our custom is to read the end and say chazak, chazak, chazek, as we say in the synagogue, be strong, and maybe we'll be strengthened. So we'll save a few minutes for that. And then I think we'll talk about the story of the two tribes that don't want to go into Israel. We talk about it every year, but hopefully this year we'll talk about it from a little bit of a different angle. In short, what happens is Moshe hears two tribes approach and say, we want to stay east of the Jordan. Moshe, no way to say this, gets either very angry or very frustrated. He's not a happy camper. He starts accusing them of being like the spies. And he says, this is exactly what your ancestors did 40 years ago. And because of that, they delayed our entry for 40 years. And now you people are coming, you sinners are getting up and you're emulating their mistake. He is not happy, okay? But then they negotiate back and forth. They talk, they cut the deal. At the end, Moshe says, okay, if you want, we'll cut the deal. And the deal is going to look like something like you will build, you'll keep your family and your possessions, your cattle east of the Jordan. You will go to war in front of the Jewish people, not only with the Jewish people, but you'll be the chalutz, you'll be the pioneers of the war. And if you do so, then you're going to get your land. And they agree and they cut a deal. We're still not so sure, was it a good deal or bad? Was it good or bad? Would Moshe prefer that they don't do it? Should he prefer they do it? It's a complicated story. It's also complicated because we don't really have all the facts. The Torah just tells us the facts. It doesn't give us the narration. It doesn't tell us the moral judgment. Was this a good idea or bad idea? So we'll start from the perspective that it wasn't such a hot idea. And Moshe was not even happy with the deal even after he made the deal. It was sort of agreeing to the deal, but he would prefer that everyone go into Israel. But then we're going to say that maybe it was a good deal after all. Maybe it was positive after all. So we discuss this every year. I just want to add one or two dimensions here. And there's so many ways to look at this. So again, I have given myself 6 minutes. So it's a little bit of a challenge. I'm just going to try to limit maybe one or two perspectives here. We'll start with the perspective that it was not the good idea. Moshe was not happy about it, and it wasn't such a good idea. And later, it wasn't such a good idea, but nevertheless, once he sort of, how do you say it? You cut your losses. He doesn't want this to blow up into a full-out rebellion. So as soon as they say we'll go to war first, he realizes, okay, you're still committed to the cause of the Jewish people. Okay, I'll let you stay east of the Jordan, even though I'm not too happy that you're staying east of the Jordan. Someone showed me a clip this morning. Someone sent it this morning. I don't know why he sent it. It could be. Give me a second. Let's see if I can figure this out. I'm not going to find it right now. But someone sent me a clip this morning of Jabotinsky giving a speech in 1934 about his philosophy, which is the Jewish people have to make a homeland on both sides of the Jordan, not just east of the Jordan, but west, not just west of the Jordan, which is Israel proper, but east of the Jordan. And it's like a 2-minute clip. He's speaking in Yiddish, beautiful, beautiful Yiddish. And it's on video. And his argument is, amongst other things, well, that's the first portion of land we took over when we came to the region. Of course, that's true. That's in the Torah. I think it could have been his yard site or the anniversary of the speech. I don't know. Whatever the case is, let's look at the story inside. We'll see some of the verses, and we'll see maybe an angle, maybe a perspective or two. Right, the descendants of Reuven and Gad had an abundance of livestock, very numerous, and they saw the land of Yazer and the land of Gilad, and behold, the place was a place of livestock. The descendants of Gad and the descendants of Reuven came, and they spoke to Moses and to Elazar the Kohen and to the princes of the community, saying, Atara, Divo, and Yazer, Nimra, Cheshbon, Ale, Sevam, Nevo, and Beon. The land that the Lord struck down before the congregation of Israel is a land of livestock, and your servants have livestock. They said, if it pleases you, let this land be given to your servants as a heritage. And this is a very painful statement. Do not take us across the Jordan. Thereupon Moses said to the descendants of Gad and the descendants of Reuven, shall your brethren go to war while you stay here? Why do you discourage the children of Israel from crossing over to the land which the Lord has given to them? This is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. And that's the spies. And he gives a whole description. And then he says, verse 14, very, very harsh. And behold, you have now risen in place of your fathers as a society of sinful people. That is harsh, right? To add to the wrathful anger of the Lord against Israel. If you turn away from following him, he will leave you in the desert again, and you will destroy this entire people. Moshe's like, this is a big problem. What are you doing here? So now they offer the deal. They approached him and said, we will build sheepfolds for our livestock here and cities for our children. We will then arm ourselves quickly and go before the children of Israel until we have brought them to their place. Our children will reside in the fortified cities on account of the inhabitants of the land. We shall not return to our homes until each of the children of Israel has taken possession of his inheritance. For we will not inherit with them on the other side of the Jordan and beyond, because our inheritance has come to us on the east bank of the Jordan. Not a bad deal. If Moshe is afraid that these two tribes are trying to secede and trying to not go into Israel because they're afraid of the inhabitants and they're going to cause fear in the rest of the people, which is exactly what the spies did. Now Moshe says, okay, at least it's not going to cause that problem because these people are not afraid of the inhabitants. They're willing to go to war first. Okay. So Moshe now reiterates their deal and he says, okay, fine, we'll do it. Moshe said to them, if you do this thing, if you arm yourself for the battle before the Lord, and your armed forces cross the Jordan before the Lord until he has driven out his enemies before him, and the land will be conquered from before the Lord. Afterward, you may return and you shall be freed of your obligations from the Lord and from Israel, and this land will become your heritage before the Lord. If you do not do this, behold, you will have sinned against the Lord, and be aware of your sin which you will find you. So build for yourselves cities for your children and enclosures for your sheep, and what has proceeded from your mouth you shall do. And they said that's what we're going to do. Okay. So if you're listening carefully, I don't know how carefully you were listening. I'm not sure how clear this verses are on the screen. But if you listen carefully, it seems that they offer the proposal, and Moshe accepts the proposal, reiterates the proposal, and everybody agrees. But you always have to read the verses carefully, because if that was the case, the verse could have just said, Moshe said, if you do this, verse 20 would be enough. Moses said that if you do this thing, then it's a deal. Which thing? The thing you just mentioned. But Moshe reiterates the whole deal. And why does Moshe reiterate the whole deal? So in the past, I said one thing. Today, I'm going to say something else. And today, I think is more convincing. Because today, you could see how many times Moshe amends what they say. And if you want to be dramatic, I would say Moshe rejects their deal. He does not accept their deal. And he offers a different deal instead, even though it sounds like it's the same deal. So anybody want to guess? What does Moshe add that the people, what does Moshe add that the people didn't say?
Free of any obligation to God and Israel.
Okay. I'm just trying to count here. 5. 1 second. Okay, it has to be, I'm only getting 6 numbers, but it has to be 7 because everything in the Torah is 7. Give me just one more second. Every time I count, I get a different number. Give me just 1 second here. Beautiful, we got to 7. 7 times Moshe says this. And when you read the Torah and you see something 7 times, you know that that's the emphasis. Okay, this is going to be fun. 7 times Moshe mentions the word Hashem, the Lord. They don't mention the Lord once. Let's go back to what they say. Let's go back to what they say. What do they say? They said like this. We will then arm ourselves quickly, verse 17. We will then arm ourselves quickly and go before the children of Israel until we have brought them up to their place. Our children, okay, what's the problem? And again, shall not return to their homes until each of the children of Israel has taken possession of his inheritance. They're not talking about God. They say like this. They say, we're going to get our land here. The Jewish people will get the land east of the Jordan, west of the Jordan, and we won't take our land until the Jewish people get the land west of the Jordan. They don't mention God, which means from their perspective, Israel is just a regular piece of real estate, just a place where Jews are going to live. Could have been in Uganda, could be in Israel, right? They say their commitment is to the Jewish people. We're going to go and fight before the Jewish people until the Jewish people get their land, and then we will live east of the Jordan. In other words, from their perspective, it's just real estate. Doesn't really matter where you get your real estate. That's their perspective. What does Moshe do? Moshe is rejecting their perspective. He's accepting their deal, but rejecting their perspective. What does he say? First thing he says, Moses said to them, if you do this thing, if you arm yourselves for battle before the Lord. What did they say? They said before the children of Israel. What does Moshe say? Before the Lord. Again, 21. And you armed forces across the Jordan before the Lord, until he has driven out his enemies before him. And the land will be conquered before the Lord. It's not that the Jewish people are just picking up any place to live. The Lord is giving us this land. Afterward, you may return and you shall be freed from your obligation from the Lord and from Israel. And Elisa picked up on this. You said the Lord of Israel. In other words, they said, we're going to be freed from our obligation to the children of Israel, because they're not looking at Israel as the promised land where God's promise to the Jewish people is going to be fulfilled. And the Jewish mission is to live there. That's not what they see it. They just see it. We have an obligation to make sure that the Jewish people have a place to real estate, or where to live. Moshe keeps saying, if you don't do this, you will have sinned against the Lord. And then that's already 6. And later on the page, we get a 7th. Later on the page, you get a 7th. Verse 29. Moshe said to them, if you descendants of Gad and Reuven cross the Jordan with you, armed for battle before the Lord. 7 times he says before the Lord. Like I said, if it's 7 times, it's significant. What is he saying? You missed the boat if you think that Israel is just a place where the Jewish people are going to live. That's not what Israel is. Israel is the land that's conquered before the Lord. It's the land that God gives us because of the spiritual power of Israel and because of our spiritual mission to live in Israel and spread the light to the rest of the world. If you recognize that, then you could also be east of the Jordan. Then you could spread the holiness of Israel east of the Jordan. In other words, once you're in touch with the Jewish mission, then you can expand Israel. And that's why later, Moshe, before Moshe dies, he blesses the tribe of Gad, which is one of those 2 tribes that wanted to be east of the Jordan. And he says, you chose the east of the Jordan because there the lawgiver was buried, meaning Moshe is referring to himself. And Moshe is thanking them for expanding Israel, because now Moshe was not allowed into Israel proper. But because they wanted land east of the Jordan, they expanded the land of Israel, which I spoke about this in the past. But what I'm adding this year is you cannot expand Israel before you understand what Israel is, before you understand that Israel is the place where you live before God. If Israel is just real estate, then living in having real estate anywhere else is against your mission. But if you understand that Israel is the place you live before God, then some of the tribes are tasked with the job of spreading the holiness of Israel to the rest of the world. But you can only do that if you're anchored with the true meaning of Israel. And the true meaning of Israel is living before Hashem. So I think that's very powerful. Powerful for the people living in Israel, and also powerful for the people who are not living in Israel yet, but their work is to make the rest of the world Israel, and they will very soon come back to Israel. So it's powerful for both people on both sides of the Jordan. Okay, I just want to go to the final reading of the Torah. I didn't have time to talk about it, but the bottom line is the Torah is going to end on a high. How does it end on a high? Because it ends with the children correcting the ways of the parents. The Jewish people for 40 years, the generation that left Egypt rejected the land of Israel. And the end of the parsha represents how the people, especially the woman, loved Israel and desired Israel and didn't want the land to travel from tribe to tribe. They wanted to take possession of the land of Israel. And like the Kabbalists talk about the idea that the word Arvot Moab, plains of Moab, could be guarantors of the fathers. The children, this attitude toward Israel, corrected and elevated not just them, but also the past, also the story of their parents. So when we live in this world, we live for ourselves, we have our own mission, but it's also correcting and completing the mission of our parents. We'll conclude with the final verse. These are the commandments and the ordinances that the Lord commanded the children of Israel through Moses in the plains of Moab, by the Jordan and Jericho. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek, be strong, and may we be strengthened. Mazel tov, for concluding the 4th book of the Torah in good health. May we continue to grow, studying Torah, internalizing the messages, and ultimately transforming the world and returning to the land of Israel, our homeland, where we will live before God and where the light of God will travel to the rest of the world as well. Chaim. Thank you.
I am.
Thank you.